our objectives are basically three. I want to share a little bit about Carlo's life, why he is such an important saint for our times today. So to really place him in the context within which he lived and within which we live. I want to share a little bit about the angle we're taking in the film because it has a lot of applicability to the lives that we're all leading in our parishes. And then Brett, as part of that, is going to share a little bit about technology, technology addiction. What are ways in which we as a church need to address this question of technology? And then the third one, we want to give some practical tips of what are some takeaways? How do we take some of the lessons that we can learn from Carlo's life and apply those in our parishes, in our families, with our children, etc. So again, I'm Tim Moriarty, Castletown Media. We've worked on a number of films. The last two that we've done have been Mother Teresa, No Greater Love, which we produced for the Knights of Columbus, Jesus Thirst, the Miracle of the Eucharist, which was a film that we did this past summer, and now we're really excited about this film about Blessed Carlo, soon to be Saint Carlo. So I want to start with this. What is this about? What is this film about? But more importantly, what does Carlo mean for our times? And this is just a kind of way to get us started here. In a world losing itself to screens, teenage mystic Carlo Acutis saw beyond the social media addicted society we live in and offered an answer if we're willing to listen. So I want to just sort of sit with that for a moment. In a world losing itself to screens, in this presentation, we want to show the real positives, the real opportunities that are there with digital media, but we also want to show some of the dangers. And so, with that being said, let's just dive into some of the statistics. Where are we today, and what culture, what cultural context is Carlo speaking to? So, 95% of teens have access to a smartphone. And that's just one. I mean, any of you that have children or grandchildren are probably aware of that. The average teen is spending 8 hours, 39 minutes on screens. Now, that equates to about 50% of teens' waking hours are spent on screens. 42% of teens are reporting persistent feelings of hopelessness. 29% are living with a diagnosed mental health condition. 22% seriously considered suicide. 10% have attempted suicide. So there's something going on here that I think needs addressing. I think we all know needs addressing. Everybody, I think, is aware that there's something off in our culture. There's something off. There's something about our connection to reality that has become somewhat tenuous. And that's where I think Carlo Acutis has something to say. We'll get into this as the presentation goes, but my first thought when I heard about Carlo was to say, well, it seems like a really sweet story, and he had a project, and I thought, well, is he a saint on par with Francis of Assisi, or there was a sense of, I wouldn't say it was hesitancy on my part to really dive all in. I thought, well, it's a really nice story, but I have to say, as I've gotten into the story of Carlo Acutis, and as we've talked to people that knew him, his mother, and as we've seen how he approached this question of technology, I'm convinced that he is absolutely a saint for our times. And I'm going to share this interesting quote with you, but I think before we do that, I'd like to just first get a sense of this group here. We want to start with a poll. How familiar are you with Blessed Carlo Acutis? Would love to kind of get a sense of this group here. What level of familiarity is there with Carlo? And we'll just wait to see what the responses are. Let's see where we are. Okay. Okay, so here we go. We've got 27% say they're very familiar, 65% are familiar, and about 8% don't know who he is. And I think that's about right. I think there's a lot of people that have heard about Carlo, and there's a sense of, yeah, this is a really positive story. But there is so much more to learn. And so this is actually exciting to learn about this number. So I want to present this quote to you, and this is a way in which we've approached this question of who Carlo is and what how important he is. G.K. Chesterton has a quote where he says, "The saint is a medicine because he is an anecdote. Each generation seeks its saint by instinct, and he is not what the people want, rather what the people need." And that is where I think Carlo is important. Carlo is the saint we need. One of the things that was really interesting is we sat down quite early, about a year ago, with Carlo's mother, Antonia, and she is an incredible woman. She's an incredible woman. And we asked her, there's been a lot of work done on Carlo. There's books that have been written and other things, and all of them, very high quality. And we asked her what's been missing from her perspective. What's an angle that we should take in the film? And she said, a lot of people talk about how relatable he was. And he was, he wore blue jeans, he wore sneakers. Um, but then she said, but he was quite different. He had visions, he had dreams, had a deep connection with the children of Fatima. His grandfather appeared to him, telling him to please pray for him while in purgatory. She said, Carlo was a mystic. I think that story should be told. And that really struck us because Carlo, yes, he is relatable. If he was alive today, he'd be about 30, I think he'd be 33 years old. Um, he's relatable. He is a young person of our times. And yet there's real sanctity there. And there's a mystical quality to Carlo's life that we really want. I think it's important for us to learn about. Now, I think one of the things that's incredible about Carlo and extremely encouraging about Carlo is his parents were not religious. His mother said that prior to Carlo's birth, she had maybe been to Mass 3 times. And yet Carlo, from an early age, had this almost magnetic attraction to church. At the age of 3 or 4, they'd be wandering, going out to town in Milan, and he would want to go inside the church and spend time before the crucifix, before the tabernacle. So there was this deep sense within Carlo. His heart was burning for God, even without a context, even without a religious context. I think that's extremely encouraging to show that God is calling young people today, even without a family that's devout. Carlo's mother, Antonia, she says, "Carlo to me was a little savior. He saved me." So, real quick biographical information: was born in 1991, grew up, spent most of his life in Milan, um, and lived what to all, on the outside, a very ordinary life. He lived a very ordinary life, and there's something extraordinary, I think, about that. Father Landry, who's a good friend of Eucharistic Revival, says what Saint Therese of Lisieux did for the 20th century, he thinks Carlo's going to do for ours. I thought that was a really remarkable statement. I think one of the things that's really interesting about Carlo is he had a deep sense of God's presence in the Eucharist, which we're going to get to, but also in nature. Carlo had a sense of he had a spiritual vision. One of his favorite books was The Little Prince, and in there's this quote about it's only with the heart that one can see rightly. Pope Francis has a recent encyclical, which was really interesting. He compares and puts in juxtaposition the logic of the algorithm and the logic of the heart. And I think Carlo is really a perfect example of somebody who lived life through the heart. And in living life through the heart, he saw more. There's a story that his mother tells us of. He was out on vacation on the Italian coast, and he had a great love for dolphins. And they went off on the boat one day, and there was all of a sudden around the boat she claims thousands of dolphins appeared, and Carlo was just radiant with joy. And he told the mother afterwards that he had prayed to see dolphins. And she says this is just an example of one of these little presents that Jesus would give to Carlo. There's something very, I think, very beautiful about that story that shows a lot about who he was and his deep connection to Christ. I think it's important to say something, in the way this became really key to our approach to Carlo. One of my favorite quotes that he gave was, "We are all born as originals, but many die as photocopies." It's a very profound thing for a young teenager to say. We are all born as originals, but many die as photocopies. Thinking about Carlo is he was a real he was way ahead of his time in terms of what was happening with the digital revolution. His father tells us the story that he went and got computer textbooks on computer coding. He was fascinated by it. He was fascinated by Steve Jobs. He was fascinated by the new technology that was just that was rising up right around him in the 90s. And what's really interesting about him is that he also understood he understood the potential there, but he also understood the dangers. His mother says he had a PlayStation and he loved video games, and yet he it was very interesting in that he decided that he would only allow himself 1 hour a week of playing video games because he knew how addicted they could be. So that's another aspect of Carlo that I think is really worth paying attention to. Um, let's see the next part here is this question of how is Carlo able to engage in digital technology and remain centered, remain tethered to reality? And the answer there is the Eucharist. The Eucharist for Carlo was absolutely everything. His one of his great quotes is, "The Eucharist is my highway to heaven." And his mother says, at an early age, 7 years old, he started lobbying the priest because he wanted to receive communion early. He had that deep desire to receive Christ in the Eucharist. Every day he would go to daily mass, attend Eucharistic adoration, and he began to become distressed because he saw his peers around him. There was a lack of belief in the Eucharist. There's a quote where he says, "Well, people will spend hours in line to attend, a soccer match, and yet our churches here in Italy are empty." And so one of the things that happened to him was he visited Lanciano, the Eucharistic miracles site, where in the 8th century a monk who was doubting the Eucharist had this incredible experience of a Eucharistic miracle where the Eucharistic species became the flesh of Christ. And Carlo began to tell those stories to his friends, and they became interested in that. And he realized, aha, there's something here that in Eucharistic miracles we break through kind of this reductionistic, sort of flat scientific world that we're in, and the mystery can come back. And he said, he became passionately interested in documenting these miracles, putting them online on a website to share them with his peers. He saw this as a way to bring people back. He had this deep sense of the miraculous. It's a very, very important part of Carlo that I think is worth reflecting on, and for all of us, I think his devotion to the Eucharist is that which tethers us to the real. He is a digital missionary. There's a lot that we can say about digital technology. Looking at those statistics, they're horrific, and Dr. Brett Robinson is going to share a little bit more about that. But Carlo is the example of how to use this as a digital missionary. He spread the truths of our faith through this medium without getting lost in the medium. And another thing to say, he wasn't just a missionary online. He went out into the streets of Milan. There's a large homeless population there, and he would take care of them. So there's a way in which Carlo always remains connected to the real, to the tangible, to people right in front of him. That's another aspect that I think is important that we keep in mind. The work that he did on Eucharistic miracles has since spread all around the world. I mean, there's been exhibits that have been created for parishes. It's gone over to 10,000 parishes across 5 continents. This is this work of this young teenage boy who decided that this was a way to spread the faith. The impact has been tremendous, absolutely tremendous. So some of you know he died early. He died in October 12th, 2006, the age of 15, for acute leukemia. And he died with unbelievable grace. Unbelievable grace. His mother talks about how he was in tremendous suffering, and yet his concern was for other patients in the hospital. Doctors were amazed at just the grace with which he went to his death. Bishop Coslins, who we interviewed for the film, says that Carlo had tasted heaven because he tasted heaven in the Eucharist, and so he met his fate with absolute trust and faith. And there's a real lesson there. And one of the things I think that we look at in some of the spirit behind technology of the transhumanist movement is this attempt that we're trying to defy death. We're trying to transcend death. We're trying to get beyond our limits. And here is a young man who accepted his limits, his finitude, in I think the ultimate way in his early death, right at the time where he's coming into his powers as a young man, coming into just at the brink of adulthood. Really, here he dies and he accepts it. This is all, I think, these are tremendous lessons for us. I want to jump now to this question about technology. So that's a little snapshot of Carlo's life. One of the things I think is incredibly important that we do with Carlo as we reflect on him, especially in this year where he's going to be canonized, is what does he have to say for us today, especially young people? There's something, again, going back to those early statistics we looked at. There's something about this technology that can be used in a negative way, that's having negative ramifications. And so in the film, we want to look at that. And I want to share now the insights. We partnered with Eucharistic Revival. We've also partnered with the McGrath Institute for Church Life. So Dr. Brett Robinson has thought a lot about this question of technology, this question of how do we approach technology? How do we do so in a truly Catholic way, not just the content, but the medium itself? And so I want to throw it over to Brett to walk us through some of his insights, and then we'll throw it back at the end to kind of conclude with a bit more about Carlo. But I'd love for Brett to jump in and share some of his thoughts.
Thank you, Tim. And thanks everybody for being here. It's been one of the great privileges of my academic career to work with alongside Tim on this project. Just watching it evolve and develop has been something really special. So I think you're getting a really neat sneak preview of what I think is going to be a great film that's coming out next year. So as Tim said, I've spent the last 20 plus years thinking about technology, but not just thinking about technology, but how it affects or impacts or shapes our religious experience, because I think the two are very related. And one of the, I guess, quotes that I like to meditate on and has shaped my thinking on this comes from a former Jesuit priest named John Calkin, who said, "We shape our tools, and thereafter our tools shape us." And this quote has really stuck with me through the years, especially as I think about things like sanctity and the pursuit of holiness and people like Carlo, um, who demonstrate this tremendous formation, this interior life that's really reflective of a really deep spiritual formation. And so when we live in an age in which we are being formed by the technologies that we're using, that raises a really important question, which is what are we being formed for? And we live in the in-formation age. So this is especially, I think, relevant and poignant at this moment. So what does this look like in the digital age? When I think about formation, I think about our beliefs, but I also think about our behaviors and our habits. So those habits that we choose to develop and pursue become behaviors or a part of our behavior really shape who we are and who we become as people. And so when those habits are tied up with technological devices, that can go south very quickly, especially when it comes to spiritual formation. So I want to take you through a little example that I use to think about this, and I want to take us a little bit outside of our own context. We're all very familiar with smartphone, personal computing, but I want to go maybe a step back, a generation back, and that's to the car. So let's think about the car, right? In terms of formation or cultural formation and individual formation. So the car has a very practical purpose to get us places faster than we could go by foot or by horse, but it's also forming us. It's forming our behaviors, our habits, our beliefs. What do I mean by that? Well, when it comes to our behavior and our habits, when we have the car, after the invention of the car, we walk less, we drive more, which then leads us to think or rethink how our communities are built and structured. The pedestrian gives way to the parking lot. Our daily interactions that we would have walking down the street are diminished because now we're in the privacy of our own automobiles. Private transport becomes public transport. The car radio becomes our new travel companion. The entire landscape changes. So we need gas stations and highways and strip malls. All of these become ubiquitous. So that changes our behavior as a society and as individuals. And it also changes our beliefs. So if we think of efficiency as a very high value or good, That's one of the things that driving a car delivers is efficiency. Um, we believe that faster is better, right? So, but we also believe that more than 42,000 traffic deaths per year is an acceptable trade-off for the convenience of driving cars. 42,000 people die every year in the United States because we drive cars. So we shape the car, and then the car shapes us. So we become different people with different social cultural values, different behaviors, different habits, different beliefs that conform us to a car culture. Now, I'm not aware of any concerted sort of Catholic response to the car, right? This sounds kind of anachronistic. Shouldn't we be talking about AI or smartphones and this sort of thing? But I really do think this is a helpful example to get us out of our own water for a moment. But if we are pro-life, shouldn't we be concerned about 42,000 people dying every year in cars? If we're concerned about local parish life, shouldn't we respond to the growing trend of parish hopping, where people jump in a car to go find a better parish because they have better liturgy, better music, better preaching, something that suits their individual preferences rather than their geographic parish? If we're truly concerned about the poor, the sick, the isolated, how hard is it to stop and really tend to them when we see them on the street? And how much harder is it when we're in a car and we pass them by at 40 miles an hour? If we're concerned about the environment, as Pope Francis has articulated in Laudato Si, should we be curbing the use of cars to preserve the health of the planet? Okay, so this sounds like a little bit of an extreme example, but I'm just using it as an illustration to show a different way about thinking about technology, one in which we think about the form itself and how that shapes social and cultural life, but also our own behaviors, habits, and beliefs. So if we think in these terms, you can see why the Amish might have some things right. The Amish are a community that does not reject technology entirely. That's a myth. Instead, with each new technology, they ask, what will this do to our community? What will this do to our community? Their ethics are rooted in communal values rather than individual preferences or power. So our modern approach tends to skip over this communal concern, and we ask instead, well, what will this technology do for me? And that's not to say we're uncritical or unreflective about our technologies, but we tend to locate our ethical response to technology in these personal choices and values. We fear we might offend someone if we dare impose those values on someone else. So when we think about digital culture, the culture that Carlo was growing up in, the very early days of it, the car really is more than just a metaphor, because the car itself is a communication technology in the strict sense of the term, right? So it moves information and people at high speeds. So it's kind of a precursor to our digital landscape. In fact, we remember, some of us, that the early internet was called the information superhighway. So we had that metaphor. Okay, so what are the behaviors and habits and beliefs that come with digital technology? How are we being formed? And what are we being formed for in a digital culture? So if IBM and Apple are shaping our personal computing habits and behaviors, how are these devices shaping us? How are they shaping our behaviors, our habits, and our beliefs? So we could start in the home, right? What does family mealtime look like for most families? Well, sitting down at the family dinner table, Norman Rockwell style, for some convivial conversation has largely been replaced with private browsing on personal devices. You can go into any American restaurant, see the same thing. Parents on their phones, kids on their phones. They'd rather scroll TikTok than look at each other. So we all know these behaviors. I'm not going to belabor the point, but we see this same distraction and social disconnect on street corners, in classrooms, even at church when parents want to pacify their fidgety children. And what this does is it represents what I call an atomization of society, atom, A-T-O-M, atomization of society. We all become these kind of individual atoms or bits bouncing around the digital sphere, only incidentally present to one another. But an atom is meant to form bonds, right? If you know your chemistry, and those bonds form molecules, which make up matter. So humans are meant to form bonds. And those bonds form relationships that make life matter. And that's really important. And those relationships aren't just to one another, but they're also to God, right? So, what kind of beliefs does this digital culture breed? Well, like the car, we're dealing with some serious trade-offs. We can't fathom giving up our devices. We're on them now. We tell ourselves, they're essential for work, school, staying connected, staying informed, which means we have to accept the collateral damage of a teen mental health crisis driven largely by social media, a breakdown in the social fabric of local communities that have been replaced by online tribes and affinity groups, the decay of public discourse from respectful debate to trolling and nasty memes. So none of us believe those trade-offs are a good thing, but we accept them as the costs of living in a digital society that offers other benefits like 2-day shipping or binge watching on Netflix. But again, I would ask, if we are pro-family as a church, what are we doing about the dissolution of family bonds that comes with this private digital behavior that often includes things like children consuming pornography? If we are pro-worker, where's the response to the automation of labor and the dehumanization of people who work for companies like Uber and Amazon, where humans are just following instructions given to them by bots and algorithms? I became friends recently with a gentleman who left Uber. He was a user interface designer there. And he had become disgusted with the company because they would do things like refer to their drivers, their Uber drivers, as supply, right? Instead of as human beings. And that friend now is in the process of becoming Catholic. So, if we're proponents of Catholic social teaching on human dignity, where is our response to the teen mental health crisis that's being driven largely by these technologies? And from what I've seen, the church is trying to fight fire with fire. So, combat negative online messages with positive online messages from a Catholic perspective. Or, more often than not, we get lots of apologetics about why the church is right and the Protestants or the atheists or the whatever scapegoat is wrong. So while I am not opposed at all to preaching the gospel online or creating apologetics resources for Catholics who want to go deeper in their faith, we all know that it's far more effective to fight fire with water. So what does water look like in this case? Well, if we take the waters of baptism as our guide, we have to be willing to undergo a mini death in order to rise to new life. So in the digital context, that might mean taking off our Apple, Amazon AI glasses and putting on our sacramental glasses. We can't baptize the internet, as some people suggest, but we can recall our own baptism. We can remember that we renounce Satan, all his works, all his empty promises. And I think we tend to forget that more often than we remember it, especially when our devices, they all bear the symbol of our fall from grace, the forbidden fruit with the bite removed. So, what are we to do about this? So, I've painted what looks like a bleak picture. And if you signed up for my course at Notre Dame this fall called Surviving the Digital Apocalypse, you might think it's all gloom and doom, but it's not. We are experiencing a paradigm shift from one communication era to another. And as Pope Francis says, we are not living through an era of change, but a change of era. So when I say apocalypse, what I mean is the Greek sense of the term. It's a revelation. Something is being revealed in all of this change. Something's being revealed about what it means to be human. And that's actually a really good thing for the church. But it's up to us to discern those structural dynamics that we were talking about earlier, whether it's the car or the computer, these formal structural changes that are changing the culture, society, and by extension, our own behaviors and habits and beliefs. So I want to conclude by including my students who just finished their final exam, and their assignment was to write a letter to their future child to give them advice about how to flourish physically, mentally, spiritually in a world that's saturated with technology. So, what I'm going to share is advice from young people, some who are Catholic, some aren't, some are still seeking. Others have said this course has actually helped them give religion a second look because, in their words, we all worship something, so it's probably better to worship God than technology. So one of the things we talk about in the class and what this illustration is showing is the difference between the left brain and the right brain. And I can't get into this deep in the last 5 minutes here, but there's a really good book by Ian McGilchrist called The Master and His Emissary, where he talks about the disconnect in the modern age between the left hemisphere of the brain and the right hemisphere of the brain. He says it's the fundamental flaw of our kind of modern situation. And what he says is the left brain, and both parts are very important. It's not that one's better than the other, but the problem is they're not working together like they're supposed to. So the left brain is responsible for breaking the world into little bits and to solve very specific problems. So imagine a bird going after a worm in the ground, right? Very focused on a single task. But the right brain gives us context awareness, gives us environmental awareness. So that same bird has to be aware of predators, has to be aware of all of his surroundings in order to be safe in his food pursuit of food. We have to do the same thing, but we've lost that contextual awareness, and our world has become a series of bits. So we're trapped in this kind of left brain hyper analysis at a very fine level instead of looking at big picture, the kind of picture that religion gives us, the kind of picture that faith gives us, the whole picture, if you will. So we're living in this world, swimming in this world of bits that are literally devoid of this greater context. And if that context is missing, then we end up in a meaning crisis. That's where we are. We're in a meaning crisis. And this is where the mental health issues come from. What is the purpose and meaning of my life, right? Carlo had a very clear sense of that, and it was rooted in the Eucharist. But if you don't have that anchor, if you don't have that sense of purpose and meaning, then you feel adrift, you feel lost. The world seems random, chaotic. Okay, so your social media feed's a good example of that, right? Just pure chaos. So in this picture, what they did in this experiment was they showed artists this picture and then non-artists. Okay, and if you notice, if you look at the left frame, there's sort of a man in the background walking through an archway, and then in the foreground, there's a woman's head kind of poking out of the water. It's kind of a surreal image. But what it shows is in the middle panel, what most of us do, the modern mind tends to do, is it focuses on the figures, right? So I look right at the girl, you can see the yellow lines. Those are the lines of attention that they traced when people were looking at this picture. Or I'm looking at the guy in the back. Those are the two things that I'm kind of focusing on. It seems like that's what I should be focusing on. But artists, people that think more from the right brain or still have that right brain kind of engagement, they take in the whole thing at once. And you can see that in the right frame of that triptych. So you see the yellow lines kind of all over the place. They're not focusing on the person or the other person. They're focusing on the whole thing. It's a more holistic understanding of what's going on. So this is how our brains work. We sort of holistically take in a moment and then we try to articulate it, and that's where we bring it to the left brain, try to break it into its component parts. But we don't want to lose that kind of holistic emotional arousal, that resonance that we get from the whole picture. So what's happening online is that we are presented the world in these bits and figures. All these little figures appear in front of us, but they have no context. We don't get the whole picture. And so what they do is they try to create emotional arousal, and that emotion is often anger or lust or envy or avarice. And this is a very familiar and foreboding list to Catholics, the capital sins. Okay, so what are my students saying? I only have a minute here, so let me skip to the end here. This is what they reported on their exam as I asked them to write a letter to their future self or their future child about how to flourish in the digital environment that they're entering. First, slow down. So embrace inactivity, right? Just do nothing sometimes, right? The necessary counterweight to a productivity obsessed achievement culture is just to slow down and do nothing. These poor kids are being driven to this high, almost unattainable level of achievement, and it's burning them out. And they shouldn't feel guilty about doing nothing. Worship, in a sense, is a form of leisure that is not practical, right? It's for its own sake. So we should be allowed to do that. But the important point I wanted to leave you with is that we have to do these things together, right? It's not enough to make sort of an individual pledge or promise. We need to do this together as a church, as a community, as a parish, as a family. So, what are some other things we can do together? Go outside, go for a hike, go camping, garden together. Notice none of these are actually technology habits because the problem right now is the formation that precedes using the technology. If we are well formed, then the technology is not going to become the problem it has become. What's the issue is that we aren't well formed, and especially children aren't well formed before they enter this world. And so they become victims of the world, and they don't have to be. If we focus on these things again in families and parishes and schools, to slow down, to go outside, to be present to one another, to prioritize those human connections and rituals, and yes, to set boundaries. So set limits on it, delay the introduction of technology to children until they're a little older, certainly limit social media use, use technology intentionally, like I'm using it for this task and then I'm going to close it, right? I'm not going to just drift and surf. And again, do this together. This is what we've learned as parents of 5 children, that you have to actually get in touch with the other parents and say, look, this is what we're doing with our son or daughter. They're not allowed to be on a phone or device after 8 o'clock. If we could all agree to that, then they can't come back to us and say, well, so and so is doing it, so I feel left out, and so on. So we need this kind of collective action as a church, and that's one of our strengths, I think, as a network of Catholics. And finally, seek meaning. So I'm just going to quote one of my students and then bring Tim back in here for some Q&A. But one of the things I think helps young people, especially helps me certainly, is to journal, right? The inertia or the acceleration of the online world is always going forward. It's all speed, it's all acceleration. What's happening now? What's happening next? What we have to do is resist that and also look back, also reflect. So we can journal, we can write in a journal or however you want to do that. One student wrote in her exam, this is the letter to her child. She said, and she actually wrote hers by hand. Everyone else typed theirs on a computer. She said, I've chosen to write this with pen and paper, despite the ability to type, because I'd like my advice to be from the very hand you are so familiar with, and because I want to show you that I make mistakes too. The contact of my hand with the pen and the page are grounding. They remind me that I am here and present as a human, creating something new.
That shows what Carlo did. It's interesting that he is known as the kind of the new apostle of the internet, apostle of the digital age. But the more you look at what Carlo did, what does he do? He's online to get people offline. He's online to get people back to parish life. He's online to get people back to the tangible encounter with Christ in the sacraments. And that is something that I think all of us who are practicing our faith, who are in the work of evangelization, need to keep in mind. One of the interviews talked about how, in a way, the digital world is it's a kind of facsimile or a simulacrum of the mystical body. We're all connected, but it's also creating more division than we've ever seen in our world. Whereas the mystical body is something that binds us together sacramentally through physical encounter. Christ comes to us in the flesh, in the incarnation. The sacraments are the extension of the incarnation. And Carlo understood that. And that's how he could engage in technology, using it as a tool rather than being totally overrun by it. So this is something that I think is extremely important for us as a church. And I'll share this before we get to the Q&A. One of the things in the film that I found deeply, deeply moving is we profile 150 high school kids from connected to University of Mary in North Dakota. And the story behind it is I had called the office to do an interview with Monsignor Shea for the film. I got in touch with his chief of staff, Jerome Richter, and he said, this may be Providence. We're about to take a pilgrimage in 3 days with 150 high school kids, and the culmination of it is to visit Carlo's tomb in Assisi. So I called our lead camera guy and I said, can you drop everything? And we got a 2-week trip to Rome and Assisi. And it's become kind of the real through line of the film, where we track this journey of these kids, because part of their pilgrimage is they have to leave their phones at home. We see them at the beginning of the journey. They look at how much they're on screen. They're on screen 6-7 hours a day. And a lot of them are very unsure about the faith. Some come from Catholic homes, some don't. And there's a sense of, I don't know if I really believe in this. And we track this journey leading up, and they're learning about Carlo as they go. We track this journey where they get more and more in touch with reality. Monsignor Shea says that they become more human as they become less digital. And there's something there for us. It's not to say that technology is bad, but I think as Dr. Robinson spoke about, there's a way in which it is fundamentally changing uh, our environment. It's changing our relationships. It's changing the way we think of ourselves. And as Catholics, as people who believe in the incarnation, we've got to get back to the body, which is why things like pilgrimage are so important. If somebody is having trouble believing, in the real presence of Christ, what do? You could try to lecture them, or you could say, why don't you spend a half hour on your knees and see what happens? It's getting the body involved. So this pilgrimage is in a way was very moving to us. I think it really brought forward Carlo's legacy, because as these kids learned about Carlo, they feel this unbelievable kinship with him and connection to him. And it offers, I think, young people who hopefully will see this film something that they can really resonate with and appreciate. Um, so I would just conclude with the following: that Roadmap to Reality, which is the name of the film, Carlo Acutis in Our Digital Age. It's not really, it's a film, but it's really a conversation that I think we want to have. I think the Eucharistic Revival wants to have, McGrath Institute at Notre Dame. I think the church is saying it's time to have a really serious conversation about what is real. How do we remain tethered to reality, and how do we help, in particular, our young people who are reeling from this stuff? Let's get real serious and sober about what's happening. And I think we've got all the tools. They're all there. I mean, our faith has been telling us that the sacraments are important. We got to go back to that realization. And Carlo, that's why Carlo is important. That, I think, it's not just that he's a nice kid who was online. He's a profound practical theologian in the way he lived his life.